What happens when a simple flight turns into a public spectacle for Barron Trump? What started as a routine trip quickly turned into chaos for Barron Trump, but no one could have predicted the storm that followed when Melania arrived. It all began with the loudspeaker crackling, announcing the final boarding call, which echoed through the busy terminal of Dallas Love Field Airport. Barron Trump sat near gate C-12, his tall frame squeezed into a chair that seemed too small for him. He kept his head down, focused on his phone, trying to blend in with the crowd of travelers rushing to catch their flights. At 17, his life was far from ordinary, but he had learned how to stay out of the spotlight in public. Today, however, that skill was about to be tested. An older gate agent with sharp features and an impatient air walked over to the area. His eyes locked onto Barron, who was sitting in the priority boarding section. Something about the teenager's calm and distant manner seemed to bother him. "Excuse me, young man." The agent's voice cut through the noise of the terminal. His tone was filled with suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Barron looked up, startled but composed. "Yes, I am. I have a first-class ticket," he replied calmly, his voice steady and polite, a reflection of his upbringing. The agent studied him for a moment, his eyes scanning Barron's phone, his hoodie, and sneakers. "Can I see your ticket?" he asked. Barron hesitated. It wasn't the first time he'd been singled out for no clear reason, but there was something about this agent's tone, sharp and aggressive, that felt different. With a quiet sigh, he handed over his boarding pass. The agent's eyes scanned it, his lips forming the words aloud. "Barron Trump." There was a brief pause. The agent's expression changed, but instead of backing down, his demeanor grew more tense. "Wait here," he ordered. Around them, passengers began to take notice, their whispers rising in a low hum of curiosity. Barron could feel heat creeping up his cheeks, but he kept his face neutral. A few moments later, the agent returned, now accompanied by a supervisor. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," the agent said firmly. "You'll need to step aside while we sort this out." Barron frowned, confusion and irritation mixing. "What issue? I booked this ticket weeks ago." Before he could say more, the supervisor interrupted. "We're handling this, sir. Please step away from the gate." Reluctantly, Barron stepped aside. As he did, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Some passengers had already pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The murmurs of curiosity grew louder, and though Barron's frustration simmered, he kept quiet, unwilling to escalate the situation further. But it was clear, things weren't about to calm down anytime soon. It was only just beginning. Barron leaned against a nearby column, watching the other passengers board without a hitch. But with each passing second, the glances from the gate staff and the murmurs of the crowd felt more suffocating. He shifted his weight, restless, uncertain about what was taking so long. Was this about his last name, or was there something else at play? He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this was starting to feel personal. After several minutes, the supervisor returned, his face still stern. "We're unable to verify your identity through the system. Do you have another form of identification?" Barron furrowed his brow, irritation beginning to creep in. "My passport is in my carry-on bag. You didn't even check it." The supervisor hesitated, clearly thrown off by the logical response. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Sir, this isn't just about ID. There are procedures we need to follow." "Procedures?" Barron repeated, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. "What procedures? I've flown through this airport dozens of times without an issue." Before the supervisor could respond, the gate agent from earlier cut in. "We've had some irregularities lately. You're not being singled out," the supervisor said, but the look in his eyes betrayed him. Barron wasn't buying it, and neither were some of the nearby passengers, who began muttering among themselves. A woman in her late 40s, holding a toddler on her hip, spoke up. "What's the problem? He's just a kid with a ticket. Let him board." The supervisor ignored her, focusing on Barron instead. "You'll need to wait here while we conduct a further review. If you don't comply, we'll have to escalate the matter." "Escalate?" Barron repeated, his patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you escalating? I've done nothing wrong." As if on cue, a pair of airport security officers appeared. Barron's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the sheer disbelief at how quickly things were spiraling out of control. The officers stood on either side of him, their presence drawing even more attention. Phones were out now, recording every second. "Sir, please come with us," one officer said, his tone calm but firm. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Barron exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. He grabbed his carry-on bag. "Fine." He followed them into a small, sterile room near the gate, the murmurs and camera flashes following him like a storm cloud. Inside, the officers asked him to sit at a table. The air felt colder, heavier. One officer began flipping through his passport. "This is ridiculous," Barron muttered under his breath, shaking his head. One of the officers looked up. "We're just following protocol, son." But the word protocol started to sound like an excuse for something more sinister. The more they probed, the more Barron began to feel the weight of an unspoken bias in the room. Something that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with him. What Barron didn't know was that someone else was already on her way, and she wasn't happy. In the backseat of a sleek black SUV, weaving through the heavy Dallas traffic, Melania Trump sat poised, her phone in hand. She had planned a quick trip to surprise her son after his flight, but as her phone buzzed with a flood of text messages and social media alerts, her expression shifted from calm to concern. One message stood out. "Something's going on with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos." Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up a short clip that showed Barron surrounded by security, being led away from the gate. She replayed it twice, her brow furrowing deeper with each pass. "Driver, please hurry," she said, her voice cool but firm. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Barron sat in the small, sterile room, staring at the blank wall in front of him. The officers had stepped out to verify his credentials, leaving him alone to stew in silence. He didn't know who to call or what to do. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, a rhythm he hadn't even realized he was making. Suddenly, the door opened, and the supervisor from earlier walked in. "We're still working on clearing up the situation," the supervisor said, avoiding eye contact. "It shouldn't be much longer." "How much longer?" Barron asked, his tone sharp. "You've had all my information for almost an hour." The supervisor hesitated, mumbling something about procedures, before retreating. Barron exhaled in frustration, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just about a ticket or an ID anymore. It felt like something deeper, something personal. Outside the terminal, Melania's SUV pulled up to the curb. She stepped out with a commanding presence, despite her understated outfit. Heads turned as she strode toward the entrance, her gaze fixed and unwavering. Through the airport, her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor. She didn't need to announce her presence. People instinctively moved aside as she passed. As she approached the gate where the incident had occurred, she was met with a flurry of murmurs and whispers. Passengers recognized her instantly, some even pointing toward the area where security had taken Barron. "Excuse me," she said to a nearby airline employee. "Where's my son?" The employee blinked, stunned by the directness of her question. "Ma'am, let me check." Melania didn't wait for a response. She moved forward, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of Barron. When she spotted the small room where he was being held, her pace quickened. She reached the door just as the two officers returned to Barron. They froze when they saw her, their faces a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded an answer. "Mrs. Trump?" one officer stammered, fumbling for words. "This is just standard protocol." "Protocol?" she interrupted, her gaze icy. "You're holding my son in a small room with no explanation. What kind of protocol is this?" The supervisor appeared behind her, his face pale. "Mrs. Trump, this is all just a misunderstanding. We were trying to verify his ticket." "A misunderstanding?" Her voice remained steady, but her tone was sharp. "Do you treat all passengers this way, or just the ones you decide to single out?" The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. The silence was so thick, it felt as if time itself had stopped. But it wouldn't last for long. Melania was about to demand answers they couldn't provide. She stood in the doorway, her gaze unwavering, her presence commanding the room. Barron glanced at her, his relief visible but carefully contained. He straightened in his chair, his shoulders no longer slumped. "Mrs. Trump," the supervisor stammered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Please understand, we were just trying to ensure everything was in order." "This isn't in order," Melania interrupted, her tone as sharp as the silence around them. "You had his ticket, his passport, his name. What else do you need? A written invitation to board the plane?" The supervisor flinched but tried to recover. We flagged his name in the system, and that required additional checks." Melania tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Flagged because he's my son, or because someone decided he didn't belong in first class today?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, neither wanting to be the one to respond. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone could feel it. Finally, one of the officers cleared his throat. "It's standard procedure. Ma'am, we weren't aware of his relation to you until just now." Melania's eyes narrowed. "So this is about his last name." The supervisor opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Save your excuses. I want to speak to someone in charge. Now." The man hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping out of the room to make a call. Melania turned her attention to Barron, her expression softening as she approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Barron nodded, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Yeah, I'm fine. They've just been wasting my time." Melania gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before turning back to the officers. "Let me make something clear," she said, her voice composed yet carrying an undeniable edge. "You have humiliated my son in front of dozens of people. This is not about protocol or procedures. This is about respect, or the lack of it." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Trump will make this right. We'll ensure he boards the next flight." "You think this is about getting on a flight?" she cut in, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "This is about accountability. I don't want apologies whispered behind closed doors. I want them where they belong. Out there, where this all started." The supervisor returned, now accompanied by a higher-ranking airport official. The official extended a hand, which Melania pointedly ignored. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding," the official began. "I assure you, we'll be reviewing this incident and taking appropriate action." "Appropriate action?" Melania echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Does that include addressing the staff who escalated this without cause, or reviewing the footage that shows exactly how this began?" The official paled. "We can certainly pull up the footage, ma'am." "Do it," she said firmly, "and do it now." The room seemed to shrink as everyone waited for the official to act. A few moments later, the supervisor returned with a laptop. The grainy footage played, showing Barron at the gate, sitting quietly before being approached by the gate agent. It captured the entire exchange, from the unnecessary questioning to the escalating tension that led to Barron being removed. Exercise. Melania watched the footage in silence, her face unreadable. When it ended, she turned to the supervisor. "You owe my son a public apology." Of course," the supervisor stammered. "We'll address it right away." But Melania wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about sending a clear message that no one should endure such treatment, regardless of their name or status. The supervisor, now visibly shaken, led the way back to the boarding gate. Melania walked beside him, her stride measured and unyielding, with Barron following close behind. The tension in the terminal was almost tangible, and passengers watched in silence. The passengers who had witnessed the earlier commotion were still lingering, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected return of the teenager and his mother. As they reached the gate, the supervisor stepped forward, cleared his throat, and addressed the crowd. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to apologize for the situation that occurred earlier today. A misunderstanding involving one of our passengers, Mr. Barron Trump, led to actions that were unnecessary and inappropriate." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some passengers exchanged surprised glances while others nodded in agreement. The supervisor glanced at Melania, whose steady gaze urged him to continue. "I want to make it clear," he said, his voice firming up, "that this young man did nothing wrong. The incident was entirely due to an error on our part, and for that, we deeply regret the inconvenience and discomfort caused." Barron stood quietly, his hands in his pockets, his expression neutral, but inside he felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a public setting. Melania stepped forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the gate area. "Thank you for your words," she began, her tone measured but resolute. But words are not enough. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. This is not just about my son. It is about the principle of treating every individual with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The room fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. My son may carry a name that draws attention, but he is also a person. A young man who deserves to be treated fairly, as should every passenger in this airport. She looked around the room, her eyes sharp. Let this be a reminder to all of us, to pause and think before we act, to remember that respect is not earned by status, but by our shared humanity. We all share. The crowd erupted into applause, some passengers even standing in solidarity. The supervisor lowered his head, his face flushed with embarrassment. For a moment, the airport buzzed with a newfound energy, one not of judgment or division, but of unity. As the applause began to subside, a woman with a toddler approached Barron and Melania. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through," she said softly. "It wasn't right." Melania smiled graciously, her eyes warm. "Thank you, that means a lot." Barron nodded, grateful but still processing the whirlwind of events. But this moment of clarity wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a larger conversation about respect, equality, and accountability that would echo far beyond the walls of this terminal. As the gate area began to settle, Barron and Melania were escorted to the lounge while waiting for the next flight. The airline staff, now walking on eggshells, went out of their way to ensure their comfort. Offers of refreshments and priority boarding were made, but Melania waved them off politely. For her, this wasn't about compensation. It was about the principle. Barron sat across from her, his hands clasped in his lap. I didn't expect all that," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Melania looked up from her phone, her expression softening. "You handled yourself well," she replied. "It's not easy to stay calm in moments like that." Barron shrugged. "I've dealt with stuff like this before, just not so public." Melania leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "And that's exactly the problem," she said. "No one should ever have to get used to being treated like that, unfairly, whether it's you, me, or someone no one recognizes. Respect should never depend on a last name or appearance." Barron nodded, his mother's words sinking in. "You think they'll actually change anything after this?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Maybe not today, but moments like these add up. People notice. And sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up to make others think twice before they act." As they waited, Melania pulled out her phone and began typing. Moments later, a tweet appeared on her profile. Writing in her favorite porcelain tones, the response to the tweet began, "Today, my son experienced something no one should have to endure, being judged before being understood. This serves as a reminder to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their name or background. Respect is universal, let's do better." The post quickly gained traction, sparking discussions online about bias, accountability, and respect in public spaces. Barron scrolled through the replies, some supportive, others critical, but most echoed the sentiment that fairness and dignity should be non-negotiable. When it was finally time to board, Barron and Melania walked to the gate together. The staff, now noticeably more accommodating, guided them through without issue. As they settled into their seats, Melania glanced at her son, who had already put on his headphones, staring out the window. She smiled faintly, thinking about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Barron. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or unworthy. Moments like these were opportunities not just to teach, but to push for change, and remind the world that respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. As the plane taxied down the runway, Melania closed her eyes, her mind replaying the day's events. It hadn't been an easy experience, but it was one she hoped would leave a lasting impact, not just on those involved, but on everyone who heard the story. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from moments of adversity, and the way we respond can inspire others to rise above prejudice and embrace kindness. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder about the importance of respect and fairness. Let's make a difference, together, one conversation at a time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and change.